So let's start today's session. I'm Vishali Bed. I lead the consultancy services for social value at Action Sustainability and the social value group at the Supply Chain Sustainability School. I have over 14 years of international experience working mostly with Fortune 100 companies in core procurement and category areas and integration of sustainability into procurement processes. Uh, a little bit about our consultancy team. Action Sustainability is an award winning consultancy service company where we are supporting a lot of clients in their journey around ESG, environmental, social, and governance side. And we help our clients around regulation, legislation, and policies as well. Our services span multiple industries and cross-sector, and some examples of client we have worked with are on the screen right now. We are also the team behind the award-winning Supply Chain Sustainability School, where we are the experts and the training partners for around 250 partner organization through the school. A few housekeeping rules before we start today's session. So if you have any questions, please use the Q&A function. What we will do just because we have 90 minutes for this webinar, we will consolidate each and every question. We will respond to each and every question and we will respond to you later on. So just, use the Q&A function to ask your questions to our participants and, to our panelists today. Cameras and mics have been muted, and we will use Menti platform today. And this is your opportunity to share your insights and experience on where you are in your journey around living wages. And we will share the slides and poll results after this session. So just sit back and learn about living wages within social value. So, what we have for you today, we have a jam-packed agenda for you with lots to discuss and hear from our industry experts. For the first 15 minutes, I will give you an overview why we need to look beyond within social value and its importance. And this will be followed by 10 minutes for each of our speakers from SSC, Siemens, and Unilever to introduce themselves and provide an overview of how they are working on living wage. And afterwards, we will have a critical discussion with our panelists, asking those deep questions and challenging questions about the implementation part. And we will conclude with a pledge and an action plan for you to take away from today's session. So let's start with the Menti exercise. For this, we will ask you to log in on menti.com. You can see the code on your screen, and if you wish, you can scan the QR code as well. And we will continue our discussion over there. So if you are here, just give me a thumbs up or some kind of a signal that you are able to join the Menti exercise. Brilliant, I can see 15, 16 participants already on menti.com. Use the code or you can scan the QR code as well. And just for the benefit of everyone, Menti is an anonymous platform. So I will not come to know who is entering what. So if it helps you to provide much more transparent, insights and reflections, please do so. It's anonymous in nature. Brilliant. We have 32 participants. Please keep on joining menti.com, but we will just start with our first question today. So my first question is, of course, we are talking about living wage today. What do you understand by living wage? What is living wage for you? Just give me certain keywords. What is living wage for you? Brilliant. I think the participants, they have a really clear understanding of what is living wage, and that's a good start. We are talking about fair pay. We are talking about higher than minimum wage, the quality of life, doing the right thing. wage enabling you to live a normal and a standard life, adequate compensation, what else? Respect, affordable. So, in totality, what we are talking about is how we can pay our employees, the laborers, and whosoever is involved within our supply chain, the living standard, the living cost of living standard throughout our supply chain. And it is always above the minimum wage. And we will discuss about this a bit in detail as well. But thank you so much for entering your insights over here. Now, if you can see, what we are talking about is the real living wage. And the real living wage is the UK wage rate, which is based on the cost of living, right? And one thing, what you can see on your screen is it's not mandatory in nature. It's a voluntary thing, which you, your company, and organization, you decide if you would like to pay living wages to your employees and to your supply chain.
Supply chain.
So it's very critical to understand that living wage is the wage that is based on the cost of living. And the cost of living will be different for each and every region, for each and every country. So this is what we are talking today within the session. Moving on, now my next question is, do you think paying living wages should be part of your social value strategy? Just for the benefit of all the participants today, when we talk about social value, we are talking about PPNO 620, which is Procurement Policy Note, which is specifically valid for the UK. But just think about your sustainability strategy, think about your social sustainability plan, and what do you think? Should living wage be part of your social sustainability strategy? That's quite encouraging. 93, 95% of participants today, they think yes, it should be the part of our sustainability and social value strategy. We will wait for a moment to see if there are any other thoughts over here. I'm quite interested to understand if if you think living wage should not be a part of your social value strategy, where should living wage fit within your organizational agenda? That would be an interesting thought to share with us if possible. Brilliant. Thank you. So it's quite a good and encouraging figure over here that 92% of our participants today, they think that yes, living wage should be part of our sustainability and social value strategy. Just one question, and then we will, move to our slides again. Where does your organization stand in terms of exploring and understanding social value within procurement and supply chain? Of course, we are talking about two concepts here, social value and procurement and supply chain. So what do you think, how you are able to, implement social value within your procurement and supply chains? You think you are new to this concept, you are building awareness and understanding, and that's why you are there in this webinar today. You are implementing it and you have gone beyond and you are measuring and reporting those figures. So, where you are in your journey? Any more responses here? Great. So, most of the participants here, it's of course a big mixed bag of responses here, but most of the participants, they are building awareness and understanding around this concept that how social value can be implemented within their supply chain and procurement. And I think if you are on this webinar, that is the right start because we are talking about best practices, what our industry experts are doing within their organizations. Brilliant. Thank you so much for sharing your insights over here. And with this, we will be going back to our slides. Just one concept to touch before we start our discussion today, that this is important, and but often we miss aspect of social value. That when we think about social value, we tend to focus primarily on communities, and secondly on our employees, which is really important. However, what we need to do is we need to take a 360-degree view of social value and ask ourselves, what are we doing for our suppliers? Are we paying them on time? What about their well-being? Not only mental and physical well-being, but also their financial well-being, and what we are doing in terms of living wages over here. And this is why we are discussing about living wages in our discussion today. And just for the benefit of our participants today, when we talk about social value, we are talking about anything that you do to make a positive impact on people's life is social value. And it should be for everyone, irrespective if they are your community, if they are your suppliers, their employees, or your investors as well. So let's think about people. Let's think about the positive impact that we can create through our positive practices. Um, Now, this is a busy slide. I'm not going through each and every legislation and regulations that you can see on the screen, but in reality, there are mounting requirements for social value, specifically in the UK. Think of social value as an umbrella that can help you mitigate and address your current legislation and policies. And it also includes the growing ESG requirements. And I'm sure most of you are aware of, the upcoming CSRD and the upcoming UKSDR, and a just transition mindset. And what we have seen in practice, specifically utility companies, they are thinking about that just transition mindset, that the shift towards a more sustainable, low carbon economy that is fair and inclusive for everyone. Thinking about due diligence requirements, if you are a multinational company, you're operating in, say, Western Europe, you need to think about due diligence requirement. Specifically in Germany, we are talking about Lieferkettengesetz, which is more about what we are doing from an environmental aspects and human right aspects within our supply chain. So the message over here is, social value requirements are growing, and it will not fade away in next couple of years or so. It will only get stronger. So the thing is that we need to ask this question, that what we are doing for our suppliers through our social value strategy. And now I would like to invite David from Siemens. David, could you please just introduce yourself and share with our participants more about, Siemens' overall strategy and how you see the living wage as part of your social value? Over to you, David.
Hi, Vishali. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, David, we can.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much indeed. And thank you for organising this webinar and also for the opportunity for Siemens to participate in it. That's much appreciated. My name's David Campbell. I work at Siemens in the UK. I'm responsible for indirect material category management. We have a spend probably of about 350 million just in the UK for indirect material categories. And the living wage, I would say probably fairly recently, has been a key element of our social value strategy within our supply chain. Do you want to move to the next slide, Michelle? Just a quick overview in terms of Siemens. Hopefully most people are aware of Siemens as a company. The core businesses are digital industries, smart infrastructure and mobility. So we do anything in terms of all digital technologies associated with infrastructure and trying to help our customers on their carbon neutral journey. And then Siemens Mobility, you may be aware that they do trains. And then we have Siemens Healthineers, which do anything in terms of MRI scanners and other digital products that go into healthcare. We have a number of other portfolio companies, and then we have our internal service organisations as well. That's just a very brief overview. I'll come on to our sustainability governance program, which is a global program. We've called it Degree. So you can see on the top right-hand side what Degree stands for: decarbonisation, ethics, governance, resource equity, and employability. As an organisation, we're probably doing some amazing things in terms of decarbonisation, but I think the ethics and equity side of it, especially within our supply chain, it's evolving. And under our sustainability program, this is where we see the continuation of new initiatives that will enhance our global Degree framework. Next slide, Vishali. Right. So in terms of the degree program, what we've done is defined a number of initiatives related to supply chain. I'm not going to go into all of them, but in terms of ethics and equity, these are very important initiatives, and you can see within the ethics side of it that we've got reference to the real living wage and also the prompt payment code, where we are influencing our supply chain. But we need to do more than influence, but I'll come on to that shortly. But these are our supply chain objectives against our global Degree program. Vishali, if you move on. Just in terms of ethics and equity, for us, that they essentially equal social value. So these are some of the initiatives that we're driving through our supply chain. So you can see on the top left-hand side, we deal with social enterprise. So we're part of the social corporate challenge, working with Social Enterprise UK. And we spend in excess of 2 million purchasing volume with social enterprises, but that is growing and will continue to grow. From an ED&I perspective, we have a number of initiatives in temp labour. We work with MSD UK and we connect, and we have a considerable number of school programmes, especially to help schools in underprivileged areas, so to enhance the education of school children. And then we have the prompt payment code. So that's been recently introduced. We've got prompt payment code accreditation. So we've reduced our supplier payment terms, more than 1,000 suppliers, especially small suppliers. And those are the suppliers that we think need additional support from large organisations like ourselves. And then we have the real living wage. Now, I'm probably a little bit biased, but I think this is the most important initiative that we're working on at the minute in terms of social value. So next slide, Vishali. So let's talk a little bit more detail around the living wage. So what is our approach, and why are we doing this? I mean, one of the reasons we're doing it is to become a more responsible business. We believe we are a responsible business, but there's a lot more that we can do to support that. And we want to be working with suppliers to have similar culture to ours and also share the same values. So the living wage is now a key initiative that we're going to implement. It's going to become stronger, and we're going to continue to drive it. What the key approach is? So we're engaging with our strategic suppliers. About 6 months ago, we introduced a survey to all our suppliers, and we were quite surprised with the results, identifying if they're paying the living wage or not paying the living wage, and if they're not paying the living wage, how many employees are below or or above. And this was quite an eye-opener because we were surprised with some of the results where what we would consider a really responsible businesses or suppliers, the number of suppliers that were paying below the real living wage. And that has meant we've started significant conversations with those suppliers, and we're starting to develop our strategy. I wouldn't say it's fully developed, we're still working on it. But in terms of how do we drive this within our supply chain, you can see there we've put it being commodity driven. So obviously, within Siemens, we have a number of category managers responsible for different categories. And if you're looking in areas such as travel or hotels, in the hospitality industry, it's extremely challenging. But if you look in other areas such as MRO or fleet or temp labour, we don't see any reason why we shouldn't be seriously driving the living wage through those markets. So we might have to take a different approach in terms of how bold we're going to be against each commodity, but that's understood within our category management function now. If you just go, so just in terms of some of the things we're doing, so we're collaborating with market experts. So we've had already a couple of webinars with the Institute of Travel Management to try and educate that industry, where lots of hotels have attended and airlines, and we're bringing awareness within that market to the living wage. And we know it's a challenge, but at least we're helping to support the discussions around the living wage. Stafford Industry Associates Analytics, they are market experts in relation to contingency labour, and we've engaged with them, and they're supporting us in helping drive it through the temp labour industries. And we've been working with Ashley from Scottish and Southern to drive that as well. And just as for information, there are 1.9 million temps in the UK. And in excess of 300,000 of those temps are paid below the living wage. So from a market perspective, we believe it's important not just to look at our spend in terms of temp labour, but to try and influence and change that market. We're embedding the living wage into our procurement processes, so it's incorporated within our category strategies, within our sourcing programs. So if we go out to tender, we incorporate the living wage within our tender. Probably what's more important is in our supplier collaboration processes. So any existing contracts, as an objective now, we incorporate the living wage into our future objectives. So even though it might not have been a contractual commitment initially when we went into contract with our suppliers, we're actually bringing the living wage into our collaboration processes with our supplier. And then we're having a number of supplier sustainability days and webinars where we invite our key suppliers to influence them. And then, as you can see today, we engage with peer organisations. So we're delighted to be engaged with Scottish and Southern Energy and Unilever. We've recently started discussions with them, and you'll see their presentation in a bit, but I am delighted to be talking to them because they are far more mature than Siemens. And even though we're just on this journey, we're happy to learn and listen to the likes of organisations like Unilever. And then we're going to extend our UK strategic approach globally. I'm not sure if I've overrun, Vishali, but there's a little bit of an overview.
Thank you, David. Thanks, because we will, of course, discuss everything in detail once we start our panel session. But thank you so much for giving an overview here. And Next, we have Ashley Judge. She is the Senior Contract Manager with SSE. And Ashley, if you can share more about SSE's goals and what SSE is looking for from their suppliers in terms of living wage. Over to
Yes,
you, Ashley.
thanks very much, Shelley. So, yeah, I'm Ashley Judge. I'm Senior Contract Manager here at SSE, and I'm responsible for contingent workforce, so our temporary labour programmes, and also that obviously involves our supply chain social value strategy. Next slide, please, Shelley. So, just before I start talking about SSE in a bit more detail, I just wanted to share the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals because I think it's very key around social value and it very much links very nicely into our discussion today. So I appreciate many of you on the call will be familiar with this, but for those who are not, the UN Development Goals have been adopted by all UN states in 2015 and is a blueprint for peace and prosperity for people and the planet. So if we just have a look at some of these goals, we've got number 1, no poverty. Number 2, zero hunger. 3, good health and well-being. 8, decent work and economic growth. 11, sustainable cities and communities. And number 17, partnerships for the goals. So a lot of companies and organisations have used these development goals as a blueprint for their own sustainability strategy, and SSE is no different. Next slide, please, Shelley. So in terms of our sustainability strategy and our ESG, when I discuss this with our suppliers, they very much focus around the environmental aspect. So when we're talking, they tell me they know about us cutting carbon intensity, about increasing renewable energy output and enabling low carbon generation, which is all great. However, we do have a fourth and very important strategy, which is to champion a fair and just energy transition. And that's a guarantee of fair work and fair pay, providing quality jobs and to support social inclusion. So SSE has guaranteeing standards, which is the real living wage and living hours. So just to give you a wee bit of history, in 2013, we became a real living wage accredited employer. In 2016, we extended that out to Ireland. In 2021, we became Real Living Hours accredited, and we are now champions of the Real Living Wage as one of our 2030 goals, and we are brand ambassadors for the Real Living Wage. Next slide, please, Vishali. Now, we are very heavily reliant on our supply chain to help support us. So we work very much in partnership with our supply chain who come up with great ideas and help us with innovation, technology developments and education. But one thing which we mandate is through our contracts is that our supply chain do pay the real living wage to all employees and contractors throughout the duration of the contract. And that's great, it's contractual, so our suppliers have to adhere. However, this year we're taking it a step further and we are hosting our annual sustainability and social value event for our recruitment suppliers. And I'm asking them to sign up to the real living wage this year and become fully accredited. So not just being bound contractually, but to actually do the right thing and sign up and actually help us with our strategy and share the message as a brand ambassador. Next slide, please, Shelley. Now, this slide here I think is really important to kind of demonstrate the why. So why are we doing this? And it's very much around the reality of what it's like for workers earning below the real living wage. Now, this graph has been taken from research paper from the Living Wage Foundation, and it's a really good read. It's Life on Low Pay as Inflation Begins to Ease, which was conducted last year, and I'd recommend you have a read. But this graph just shows where we are, right? You know, this was at August 2023. So this time last year, where we were at for people on low pay income, so people earning below real living wage. And rather terrifyingly, 39% had fallen behind on household bills and 38% had skipped meals for financial reasons. Now, we often hear about the choice people are making between eating and heating, and these stats reflect that. So we've got 32% being unable to heat their home. We've got 28% falling behind with rent or mortgage payments. And then we've got 22% who've got a payday loan to cover essentials. Now, payday loans are horrific. They have generally high APRs, and if you have to enter into a payday loan to cover your essentials, it can be very difficult for you to climb out of that debt cycle. If I think about what I've just discussed in the UN Development Goals and around what we're trying to achieve as, you know, the United Nations member states, and then we look at the reality, the UK is falling behind. So I truly believe we can do better, but we need to do better in partnership with each other and working collectively. Next slide, please, Vishali. And that's why this year that we've got our supplier call for action, and we're asking our suppliers to become the Real Living Wage accredited. We know there's got to be a hook for them, so what's in it for our suppliers? So there has been research conducted by the Real Living Wage Foundation that by becoming accredited, you can increase retention, you can increase your employee engagement, productivity, and obviously it's good for your reputation and, you know, your brand awareness. But in terms of SSE here, we do very much value our Real Living Wage accredited suppliers, and we're working with them now on developing strategies and how we can work together to help support and encourage industry peers and clients to join in. The recruitment suppliers have a huge amount of influence. They have massive networks. They have massive access to client bases, far more than I do at SSE. So it's very important for our supply chain to help support us with this message. And we very much value our organisations who are supporting us with this campaign. And, you know, as David had mentioned around the tender process, we're exactly the same. So when we go out to tender, we're evaluating and scoring our suppliers on sustainability and especially social value and how they measure their contribution. And we do ask our suppliers Real Living Wage accredited. So we very much recognise at SSE that we can't do this alone. We have to do it as a partnership approach. And I hope that today's webinar inspires you to get involved. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Ashley. Lastly, we have Matthew from Unilever, and he will present on how Unilever, one of the biggest global companies in the world, is embedding living wages in global supply chain. Matthew, over to you, please.
Thanks, Vaishali. So yes, as mentioned, I am a global sustainability manager at Unilever, looking after our living wage commitment, particularly from a partnerships, advocacy, and overall strategy perspective. Maybe just a brief introduction on Unilever on the next slide for those who don't know. We are a company of brands, essentially. We have over 400 brands. Some of them you may recognize on the right there. About 3.4 billion people use our products every day. So, you know, we operate in 165, 190 countries, I think, and have a huge footprint, not just in our own operations, but in our supply chain. So obviously there's a lot of work to do when we do want to tackle issues at a global level, and a lot of different contexts we need to take into consideration. And I'll take you a little bit through what we've done on living wage to date and our journey, as well as some of the lessons we've learned and the approach we're taking. So we started on living wage, and I use the term living wage because I know that in the UK, the living wage, I think, is the kind of government set wage, whereas the real living wage is the kind of, you know, enough for a family to afford a decent standard of living. So when I refer to living wage, I mean the real living wage as you would define it in the UK. So we started in 2014. We had done a study actually with Oxfam in our factories in Vietnam to assess the living standards and the working conditions of our workers in some of our factories there. And one of the big issues that came out of that study, which at the time we defined as eye-opening, was the underpayment of workers. So many of the workers there were paid below a living wage. And this led to us kicking off a commitment to pay all our own employees a living wage. So we started this in 2014. We found that 8% of our employees, so about 12,000 people, were paid below a living wage. And it took us about 6 years to then close that gap, and we achieved that globally in 2020. That's for all our own employees. In 2021, we became a globally accredited living wage employer, and we launched this commitment towards our supply chain. And I'll go more into detail into what commitments we have on this in the next slide, and the foundational barriers as well. Maybe just to first take us through the why, and I know Ashley and David touched on it a little bit. I think, I mean, first and foremost, we know that a living wage is a human right and should be central for any business model that places respect for human rights at its core, and Unilever very much does that. But you know, beyond the moral imperative and the people case, I guess there is also a business case. It has clear commercial benefits from worker productivity and reducing turnover. It creates more resilient value chains, and we've seen that it also grows consumer markets. And we know as well that, you know, well, for business in general, we can only thrive in, you know, if the communities we operate in are thriving as well. So that's why, I mean, you know, we know that living wage enables that environment, and we see that as well from an economic perspective. Research has shown that if we were able to pay every worker a living wage, it would boost global GDP by about $4.5 trillion every year through increased productivity and spend. But there's also the external pressure that is mounting, and that we're seeing more and more of coming up from government regulation at an EU level or in the UK, but also in other countries. We've seen, for example, in the Philippines, they are starting to also ask for publicly listed companies in the Philippines to report on you know, their living wage percentage, etc. So, you know, this is something that is not just a EU or UK level requirement. This does go beyond, and we've even seen the government of India, for example, announcing that they want to replace the minimum wage with living wage by 2025. Investors also increasingly demanding it, and there's various investor groups that have actively brought this up at board level discussions, and rankings and ratings as well are increasingly including living wage requirements. So pressures, I think, from all sides, and we don't see this going away. Next slide, please. So some of the challenges we've had to date in terms of our approach for our supply chain. The first is that we see a lack of awareness and understanding of what a living wage is, and what and how to approach it, how to get started, and how to actually implement it. And that's not just by our suppliers, but you know, broadly, even at a government or NGO level or beyond. But we did a baseline assessment with our suppliers to ask them, you know, whether they were paying a living wage. In many cases, our suppliers said, yes, we pay a living wage. And when we kind of dug into the details, it was clear that they were referencing the kind of national minimum wages. And we know that there's a clear difference, of course, between those two in many cases. So that is something that we have been working on to date, is on, you know, addressing that kind of gap in understanding and knowledge. The second has been on the lack of transparent and public data on living wage. So one of the questions for the suppliers who understood what a living wage was, they would ask us, you know, what is the living wage estimate for the kind of location that I'm working in? And we were unable to provide that data because that is, you know, hidden behind a paywall. You need to pay a benchmark provider to get the kind of cost of living estimates, at least in other countries. I think in the UK that might be public already, but in other countries that is a problem. And the third has been the limited number of companies driving this, not just in their own operations, but particularly also in their supply chains. So we need other companies, I mean, not just our competitors like Procter & Gamble and others to kind of commit to this and advance this in our supply chain. But yes, we need our supply chain partners as well to move on this issue. And the role of legislation here, I think, is a particular issue that we are aiming to tackle as well, because we need to see a level playing field where those that are kind of taking the lead and trying to drive this impact don't end up kind of penalized or at a competitive disadvantage. Next slide, please. So these are the two goals that we have at Unilever. The first, well, actually, let me jump to the second one, because this was the one we had set back in 2021. No, sorry, the second target. I mean, so by 2030, 100% of suppliers pay their workers a living wage. We set this in 2021. And that is when we did this kind of benchmark assessment, and we realized that there was a big knowledge gap to fill, and the need to kind of first work on bringing suppliers on board. So earlier this year, we announced this 2026 short-term target to ensure that 50% of our procurement spend, so I think our procurement spend is about 40 billion euros or so. So 50% of procurement spend is with suppliers who have signed our living wage promise. And the promise is basically asking them to commit to assessing the gaps in their own operations, to putting in place a plan of action, and to reporting on progress. And a key part to trying to increase signups is through our capability building program, which we launched at the end of May. And we are already this year have surpassed, in theory, well, by the end of the year, we hope to report it publicly, but we've surpassed our target for about 28% of that spend to be part of the living wage promise. So a real kind of already seeing kind of movement from our supply chain on that side, which is really encouraging. So that is one of the lessons that we learned. The awareness was lacking, and we needed to work on building those capabilities. So we have launched this, and we've done this not just at a global level, but also focused in high-risk markets, trying to really make it local. So we did some webinars in Chinese and Mandarin in China, in Indonesia, and India, in Brazil, and in 7 countries in total. And the last one is also to invest in case studies to really show A, how others are approaching it, but B, also to further demonstrate that kind of business case and the business benefits. And we hope that by the end of the year, actually, we're doing a study with EY in the Philippines, which is aiming to do exactly that, showcase the business benefits in paying a living wage. Next slide, please. So the advocacy part plays a really important drive this in our supply chain, because we know that as Unilever, we can influence the suppliers maybe that are only providing goods and services to Unilever, for example. And in many cases, actually, we had a target for 2023, which was that 100% of our dedicated collaborative manufacturers, so that's factories that make products solely for Unilever, would have a contractual requirement to pay their workers a living wage. So we've achieved that at the end of 2023. But our dedicated suppliers only represent a small share of our 52,000 or so suppliers. So the level of influence that we have really depends on our spend, particularly. And as we get further and further away or into suppliers where our share of the spend is lower, advocacy plays an even greater role in trying to influence that change. So that's why there's kind of 3 parts to our work here. One is to work on accelerating other companies' living wage commitments. We are part of many business coalitions trying to talk about the business case, trying to share our learnings, share our approach, and trying to get them on board. Our CEO, for example, last year went to the private sector forum, spoke to 150 or so other CEOs and heads of state to promote the living wage as one of the key action areas that business needs to focus on in order to achieve the SDGs. And he will do that again this year at the UN General Assembly in New York. The second is on creating an enabling environment, including by providing access to data and tools. So I mentioned data before. On the 1st of May of this year, Unilever and 11 other companies funded a benchmark provider called Wage Indicator to publish their data for free for 165 countries and 2,700 regions across the world. That means our suppliers can access that data for free. They can look up, what is the living wage in a specific location. But actually, not just our suppliers. Anyone, even even a worker, can look it up and see, are they being paid fairly or not. So that's a huge unlock for the agenda that we hope will have massive ripple effects. We've also done a lot of advocacy towards the International Labour Organization, which earlier this year, they announced a globally aligned definition of living wage, as well as putting in place some principles for how to measure it and for businesses to approach it. But we also know that the ILO the International Labour Organization, will play a massive role on the third part here. which is raising minimum wage towards living wages. I mentioned the India example where they want to get minimum wage to be at a living wage level by 2025. We are working in 6 or 7 countries to try and drive that change. First, by working with other businesses to build a kind of joint private sector voice on the issue within certain countries. And second, to go to and actively advocate for this change. And in the cases where the ILO is taking an active role, we are supporting them in that as well. So in the case of India, we are looking to support them in getting the government to actually raise that minimum wage, because this will mean that we have that kind of level playing field, and that it will mean that we don't have these concerns about the competitive disadvantage and the willingness of suppliers to take action, because it will be a requirement. So still a lot to do, as you can imagine, but I think this is my last slide if I'm not wrong. But yeah, happy to discuss if there's any more questions.
Brilliant. Thank you, Matthew. We will take more questions when we start our discussion and conversation. Before that, if I'm able to play, there is a great video from Aviva, which will give us what are the benefits in reality when it comes to real living wage. Just let me make sure that my sound is on. Just 1 second. I hope you are able to hear this video. Yeah.
Would then turn around and say, well, no, we can't. The living wage was introduced in 2014. That meant quite a lot to me. It meant that there was money to be left at the end of each month, rather than just put all the money into bills. It also meant that I was able to actually give up some part-time work, which meant that I was at home more and not feeling so tired. I was able to buy Leah a laptop for homework because she's now going to be taking GCSEs. The living wage makes me feel very proud to be working for Aviva. It gives you higher self-esteem. It gives you more confidence. You can hold your head up high. It makes me feel quite emotional to think about it, and it's made me want to stay there. I wouldn't want to go anywhere else.
I think this is important to understand what difference does the real living wage can make to someone's life. So let's move on and let's start our conversation. And what we will do, we have our 3 panelists today here. I have, I think, 4 or 5 questions for you. But what we will do as we progress in our conversation towards our discussion, I will just add certain elements because I'm just going through all the Q&As that are coming from our participants today, and I will be adding certain elements from that Q&A as well. So let's start our discussion, and probably, David, I would like to start with you. Just give us an overview. It's more around understanding what is the make of your supply chain. Because of course, when we talk about Siemens and specifically your business unit, I'm sure there is a kind of a mixed supplier base sitting here, which is, more local, more global in nature. So what is the make of your supply chain? David, sorry, I can't hear you.
Sorry for Charlie. Can you hear me now?
We can. Yes, we can.
Okay.
Thanks.
It's quite varied. From a UK perspective, we have, I would probably say 80% of our suppliers are UK based, say 20% overseas. And of our UK suppliers, I think in excess of 40% are small SMEs. So, but we have a lot of strategic suppliers. So it's probably fairly diverse, and we have many manufacturers, and we also have many suppliers who are service orientated. But people may think that most of the supply base are technology suppliers, but that's not necessarily the case. So we have lots of suppliers that maybe historically have supported not just Siemens but other industries with low cost. I think from a procurement perspective, historically, there's been a lot of focus on driving costs down, and a lot of suppliers react to that. So as an organisation, as a function, the procurement needs to understand what our objectives are and what the impact can be when we're actually sourcing. We want to drive costs down as much as we can, but we don't want to do it at the detriment of society. And I think historically, probably procurement haven't done that. I know I've probably gone off a little bit of a tangent, Vishali, in terms of your question. But our supply chain is quite diverse and varied.
And David, maybe I'm picking this point from Matthew around level of influence on suppliers. From your perspective, what is your level of influence on your supplier base when it comes to, just for the benefit of participants, we will be using the term living wage, though in the context of UK, we are talking about real living wage, but overall, we are talking about what is above and beyond the minimum wages for different countries. So David, what do you think, what is the level of influence you have mostly on your suppliers?
I think that varies, as I mentioned earlier, and also what Unilever was saying. You need advocacy organisations to help drive it, because we can't just do it on our own. So there are certain suppliers where we have a high level of spend where we can definitely influence. Because they respect that purchasing volume and the leverage we've got. But we want to do it in collaboration with our suppliers. But there's lots of organisations where we don't have enough purchasing spend with them to influence on our own. So we need to get the markets and other procurement organisations to help influence that. And I think together we can make a huge impact. That the UK has had the highest level of poverty this year, and the signs are, the indicators are that the level of poverty is going to increase in the UK. But together, businesses can make a huge impact in addressing that poverty, and collectively we can do it. On our own, we can't.
Brilliant. Thank you, David. Ashley, if you can just describe your supply chain and your influence level.
Yeah, I mean, our supply chain, just kind of like what David has said, is very complex. It's very diverse. We range from working with other big FTSE companies. We have a strong partnership with Siemens, for example, but we also work with very small local suppliers, diverse suppliers. So, it's getting that balance right. I suppose in terms of influence, exactly as David says, we have a lot of influence with some suppliers. We could, if we wanted to, mandate it. Do I think that's the right thing to do right now? Probably not, but there is certainly, we have a lot of influence, and I think right now it is very much around the partnership piece. We're educating. I think there's still a real lack of awareness of the real living wage out in the market. So it's about selecting suppliers who we know can have an impact, who we know will partner with us, and who will want to do the right thing and understand it. And so that's why we've started with our temporary labour suppliers, because one, they get it, and two, they have access to a huge market, and we think that's what can really make a difference.
Brilliant. Matthew, one question for you around your supply chain is how we can deal with the global supplier base? Because, of course, as Ashley and David, they have mentioned, it's always a mix of a supplier base. We are talking about local suppliers and global suppliers. How do you think, we can deal with global supplier base?
Maybe just to clarify, when you say global supply base, are you talking about kind of outside the UK, or you mean suppliers that are working across the kind of globe? That's just so I'm clear on the question.
I think from Unilever context is across the world, across the globe.
Yeah. So I mean, I think it depends. And maybe as Ashley and David were saying there, right, and the link to the spend. When we're talking about kind of suppliers that have a global footprint or are working all over the world, those are often the kind of some of the biggest suppliers out there that Unilever may represent a small share of spend. But for us, they may actually represent a big spend, at least from our side. So they're obviously a priority supplier, and they're one that we would leverage the kind of relationship that we have with them at the most senior level that we can. I think there's slightly different levers that we can pull with suppliers that are from that kind of size. In many cases, for example, we meet with these suppliers at these big global events, World Economic Forum, UN General Assembly. We host events or sessions where we promote or talk about the living wage, the needs, etc. With our supplier capability building program, we were targeting, for example, two groups. One is some of our biggest spend suppliers, so the ones where we're really spending the most of amount of our procurement spend with, while also focusing in those kind of high risk markets like India, Indonesia, Brazil, etc. So focusing in on suppliers that are more based in the global south, I guess. And I think with that kind of capability building program that we kicked off with our chief procurement officer and chief sustainability officer, we showed the real how Unilever takes this very seriously, and how we are trying to kind of actively support suppliers and bring them on this journey, because we recognize it's not something that can be done overnight, and it's something that has to be done in partnership. So I mean, I think that's kind of the approach that we've been taking, at least, to bring suppliers on board.
Thank you. David, I would like to ask one thing, because you mentioned in your slides that Siemens overall, you are extending your UK strategy to a global kind of an approach. So do you have anything to share over here, how you are doing this global approach?
Yeah, of course. So from a UK perspective, we adopted the living wage a number of years ago. And you probably think from a Siemens perspective, we're a technology company and we might not have that many people below the living wage in the UK. But we did have some. There were pockets. We have technology in terms of meters, but we have meter readers because we also are a service industry, and we have all our facilities management providers, which are cleaners and caterers and security people. And we established then that they were being paid below the living wage. So we adopted the living wage, we implemented it, and we addressed those. But it's only recently we've started to look at our supply chain, and we've recognised that we've got a lot of work to do in terms of driving our supply chain. But we are doing that. So the question that you're asking from a global perspective, we need to get where Unilever are. I'm absolutely, I admire what they have done over the last 10 years or so. So at the minute we're putting a business case together to go to our global colleagues. There's two elements of it. It's to convince our head of sustainability, Judith Weiss, who's also head of HR. So we've got to go to our main board, and we've got to influence our main board to adopt the living wage on a global perspective. Now, I think because of the way our Siemens are, and from a board perspective, I don't think we'll have an issue in persuading them. Now, once we do that and we agree that it's going to be adopted internally, then we can start talking about implement it from a supply chain, because that's the natural next step. So we're on that journey that Unilever have already taken, but I don't think we're going to have a problem in joining Unilever on that journey. But the first step, we've got to influence our board. The discussions are taking place. We are looking at 5 different countries where Siemens are very strong, and we've assessed what the situation is there, and we're bringing that feedback and that analysis into our business case that we can present to our global managing board, and then the journey will start from a global perspective. But I'm absolutely positive that Siemens will commit to it.
Brilliant. What I'm hearing a lot is about collaboration. If we really want to make real living wage a reality locally and globally, we need to think about partnerships and collaboration over here. Thank you, David. And just one thing, because I was going through this report, Poverty Stats from Joseph Rowntree Foundation, and it clearly shows that there is high level of poverty for some groups in the UK. And I'm just quoting the stats from that report, that more than 1 in 5 people in the UK, which is almost 22%, are currently in poverty from 2021 onwards. So my question is more, of course, from a UK angle, that how do you think your efforts, specifically from your organization, can help to, uplift the situation, the poverty situation in the UK? Because we are talking about supply chain, we are engaging with 1,000 plus, supply chain partners. How do we think we can contribute in this direction? Ashley, would you like to start over here?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot that we can do. And I mean, if I just take what David and I have been doing in Siemens, so I'm fortunate enough I met David at a round table. And following from that, we had a conversation around Siemens and SSE's social value strategy. And when he talked about what he was doing around the real living wage, I got very excited and said to him, well, what can I do to help? Probably a bit more excited than that, actually, if David, if you remember. And we both started having those conversations, with our recruitment suppliers, and I think that influence is to change, in order to change, to make social value change and to really, really change the poverty levels, we all need to take a step up. And we can't do it. We can't do it on our own. And actually, I've had a lot of fun this year working with Siemens and working with other organisations and being out in the market discussing why we should become real living wage accredited employers. And it's about the partnership. So the more companies that can get involved, the more partnership, the more we work together, have some fun, go out and speak to people, go out and actually start driving it, track and measure the impact. And we will see change, but we can only do it if we currently continue to educate and work together.
Thank you. David, any thoughts from your side?
I think there's lots we can do. What was interesting in your survey earlier on, I think half the people, or a number of people, were just on the journey, and a lot of them wanted to get more awareness, and I think this is what we're finding. There's kind of a lack of awareness within the UK and UK organisations, so we really need to push that. This is a serious issue, but it's an absolutely fantastic opportunity where we can make a difference. So collectively, this is why we talk to yourself, Vishali, to do a webinar to promote how important the living wage is from a social value perspective. As I mentioned, we did a survey with our suppliers, and the results were quite astounding. I'll just give you one example, which has created a little bit of a dilemma. So we spend a lot of money on waste management. Now, in terms of UK suppliers, there aren't that many big waste suppliers in the UK. But our current supplier, who do a fantastic job for us, have 3,500 employees that are below the living wage, and yet their main competitor is paying the living wage. So what dilemma does that create to us? You know, so we're looking at extending the contract with our existing supplier, but now that is being absolutely challenged, and we're not going to do it. We won't extend that contract unless this supplier commits to it or puts an actual plan of action in to achieve the living wage. Because we can't just talk about it and not do the appropriate action. So, but there's other parts. So engage a number of things, engage with other procurement organizations, talk about it, debate it, engage with your suppliers, actually find out what you're doing. Don't just put it into part of a procurement process. That can be important. It's more, what can you do with your existing suppliers? And find out what the current situation is. If an organization is not already part of the living wage, then go and talk to your managing board and tell them how important this is. Because it's difficult for organizations to drive it through the supply chain if they're not currently signed up to the living wage themselves. So there's a number of activities. You can, there's an offer, given everybody on this call my email address. I'm open to anybody contacting myself to talk about the living wage if it will help them on their journey. And I'm sure there are lots of organizations who will openly support those discussions as well.
Very encouraging. Thank you, David. I just want to take our conversation back to procurement. And from my experience working in healthcare industry, at least I can tell you, when we started looking at, living wage compared to that minimum wage kind of a discussion, it was more about facilities management, that how we can look at those categories where cleaning staff are there, catering staff are there, we have security guards and so on. So that became more like a starting point for us to look around the living wage. So maybe Matthew, I would like to start with you. Do you have any categories or specific spend where you started looking around living wage from your experience?
Yeah, happy to do that. I guess I think we actually did start with that approach as well, looking at some of the categories where, again, we might have the most leverage through our spend, those who are like closest to our own employees and who are very linked to our business. So facilities management did fall under that, but we also had, as I mentioned there before, the collaborative manufacturers. So people working in factories that we don't own, but that only make Unilever products. As contingent workforce as well. So it could be people that are, for example, working in our factories, but are not employed by Unilever. They're employed by a third-party labor agency. So there's a few examples of those that go beyond kind of facilities management, looking at the kind of, contractors, contingent workforce. Same with Salesforce, so people who we recruit in certain countries to actively sell our products to retailers or other. Those are the ones that we really want to target as a kind of first step, whilst we kind of go further and further where maybe we are more disconnected from the worker and where our level of influence is lower. Then that's where the kind of advocacy role plays an even greater role. But those are the kind of categories that that are a bit more easy, I guess, to start on in terms of implementation as well.
Great. Ashley, same question. And specifically, if you look around the utilities sector, which are the categories that comes to your mind where we can start looking at living wage?
I mean, we've mandated it across all of our categories. So it is, if you're working, on behalf of SSE, you will be paid at a minimum the real living wage for the duration of that contract. But the reality is, what happens once that contract ends for that individual who had been, contracted out to SSE and then goes on to another employer, then their rate may drop. And, that's out of our control. So that's why we're encouraging our suppliers to sign up to the real living wage, so that that individual doesn't just enjoy the benefits of being on a real living wage whilst they're working on behalf of SSE, but once they move on to another contract, they will get paid too. And obviously all of our own contractors who we directly contract with, and in terms of our, through recruitment agencies, and also our employees are all real living wage accredited, are real living wage paid. So it's, it's very important to us. It's very important to us to try and educate, to try and continue that line of real living wage payment further down the line when they're not contracted with us.
Brilliant. Thank you, Ashley. David?
So what's the extended question?
It's more about which categories can be a good starting point when you start this journey around living wage.
I think so we're responsible for indirect. So as I say, we've been talking. We spend a lot of money on our temp labour. So we talked to our MSP and our tier 1 suppliers, and we found out that one of them was accredited. But the conversations is to influence them, and they're starting to do that. We've now got 4 of our key strategic suppliers in terms of temp labour that are signing up to the living wage. And the discussions have been really positive, because there was a lack of awareness, but they're signing up to it, which means they can influence their other customers. And that's important. It's not just the temps that they're providing to Siemens. It's about them as an organisation and as an industry sector. How can they influence all that industry? As I say, there's 1.9 million temp workers in the UK. 300,000 are being paid below the living wage. So these key agencies, they probably represent 80% of that demand. And if they all sign up and agree to it, they can influence their customers to start to pay the living wage. We're finding from an MRO perspective, we have lots of different suppliers, and they're being very receptive to the discussions. Hospitality is a challenge, so that needs more of an education in that market. But we're starting to do that with the likes of the Institute of Travel Management. Logistics, it's probably varied. We have a big spend on logistics. Most of the logistics providers, in terms of a logistics transportation service, are paying the living wage, but many of them have warehousing services. And in the warehousing services, they are paying below the living wage. And it's probably because traditionally, if you look at why that is the case, I've worked. I don't like saying this, but I have to accept that this is partly true. I've worked in procurement for 40 odd years. We've always been educated to drive our costs down, and look at where we can have leverage. And we're trained to the hilt in terms of our negotiation processes and our e-bidding and e-auction processes. And the effect is to drive costs down as much as you possibly can. Now, it's only in the last few years where we're starting to challenge ourselves as a procurement function. I'm not just talking about Siemens, I'm talking about our function, where we're saying we need to do this, but we need to do it ethically. And driving costs down, where you're driving costs down to a minimum wage, because if you're asking suppliers to cut costs, there's only certain areas they can cut costs. That's either in the material costs, the labour costs, their operational costs. And if they can cut the costs in labour, then obviously they will. So they're reacting to what the procurement function has always driven in the past. So the procurement functions now need to hopefully take a more social view on what they're doing. and change their processes and understand that we shouldn't just be driving costs down to the absolutely minimum. We should be taking a responsible approach and making sure that if we're having these tender processes, don't just screw our suppliers. Let's engage with our suppliers and make sure that we are engaging with them and going into contracts where they are paying a fair wage. Because the minimum wage in the UK is not a fair wage.
Brilliant. Thank you, David. And I think what you have put here is a kind of a hard-hitting question that to change the DNA made of you for procurement, right? Because the DNA of procurement is always cost, cost, cost. And now we need to think about social values, social impact. And I think procurement are rightly placed to bring that kind of a social impact. We have the biggest influence on our supplier base and supply chain. So we are rightly placed to, talk about living wages, how we can do better within our supply chain. So I think it's quite important that we as procurement professionals, we need to think beyond cost and think about how we can change life for good. So moving on, one of my last questions for the panelists today here is, and I'm again taking Matthew from your presentation, that Unilever specifically by 2026, you want 50% of your procurement spend to sign your living wage promise, right? And by 2030, 100% of your suppliers should pay their workers a kind of a living wage. So on that question, I just want to understand from the panelists today, what do you see in the future? Will there be kind of penalties or actions for suppliers who do not adopt a living wage? What will be your strategy over here? Matthew, if you would like to start here.
Yeah, so I guess, I mean, our intent is not to get to the stage of kind of focusing on the stick, I think, right? And that's why we have this 2026 target, which is a little bit the carrot. So bringing others on board and doing this capability building program, providing them the data, trying to unlock a lot of the barriers, etc. I think, that's where we will focus, at least until then, and that's where we will continue to focus our energy, is on trying to bring others on board, because the alternatives are that, if Unilever decides not to work with a supplier because they aren't paying a living wage, there's a risk that, the impact that we have is that that supplier ends up working with someone else, right? And who doesn't ask for a living wage. So that's why we need to kind of level the playing field. We need to bring that system level change as well, because we don't want it to be a situation where we decide not to work with the supplier and the workers who we want to have a positive impact on end up not kind of getting there, right? So yes, we have this 2030 commitment. It's part of a future mandatory requirement as part of our responsible partner policy. So, that is what we ask suppliers to do, is that, by 2030, they pay their workers a living wage. But, we really want to focus on bringing them on board, I guess, without having to focus too much on the kind of consequences of the policy, et cetera, in 2030. But, the intent of that policy is very much that, if you can't fulfill the responsible partner policy, which all our suppliers have to sign, then there are conversations about the future of the partnership that we have together. Absolutely. But as I say, we really need to bring that kind of system level change, get government involved, get other businesses to commit to the agenda, and I think you heard from David, right? Get that level of commitment from companies to drive that positive change.
Brilliant, thank you. Ashley or David, any thoughts over here?
Yeah, I agree. I think it's the diversity of supply chain piece which could be a problem if I was to, I mean, yes, they're mandated to pay it the real living wage whilst in our contract, but if we were to mandate that they had to be real living wage accredited themselves, that can be a problem for us, especially for a startup. We can't, the diversity of supporting small businesses could be difficult. So mandating it probably not right for right now, but let's educate and aspire to ensure that people are on our journey with us and becoming real living wage accredited at the right time. And it should, hopefully, if enough organisations do it, it would become a global standard. And that's why we're here today. That's what we're working towards.
Right. Thank you. David, anything from your side?
I think you've heard from all the three organisations. We're all extremely collaborative with our suppliers. So the approach is not the stick. We don't want to beat them up and tell them this. But I kind of think at this stage of the journey, it's about having the conversations and influencing them. But we have to point out that it's an absolute consequence that at some stage, if they don't, then we're not going to do business with them. That's Unilever are saying it from 2030, they won't do business with suppliers. From a UK perspective, we're going to be exactly the same. We're now thinking about adopting the target that Unilever have got, where we want at least 50% of the volume to go to be with suppliers that are signed up to the living wage in 2026. Now, I think that's achievable. And it might be that through our discussions with suppliers, if they're not receptive, if they're not showing any signs that they're going to change what they're doing, then we'll move away. Because if they're not thinking about or won't engage in that dialogue and then they're kind of showing that they've not got the culture that we want to work with. If they've got a challenge at the minute and they can't implement the living wage now, if they start that debate and understanding and have a discussion of how to get there and put a plan in place, then that's fine. We're not asking people to say, you pay this much now, and then in a few days' time, you've got to increase all your costs. That's not the case. There can be a level of journey. But let's not think we're talking massive amount between the minimum wage and a living wage. It's not as if in the UK they're doubling their costs. It's not that. So initially engage with the suppliers, try and influence them, have those positive discussions, and I think most people will be receptive. But absolutely, if they're not going to join us on that journey, we won't be dealing with them in the future.
Brilliant. Thank you. Thanks, David. I have a lot more questions around tenders and evaluation, but I'm mindful about the time as well. So my last question for the panelists today is, what would be your advice or tip for large company like yours on how they can implement this social change? So should we start with you, David? What will be your tip or advice for large companies?
I think there's two recommendations for me, especially those that are just starting out. One, if your own organisation is not signed up to the living wage, please go and talk to your board about it. Influence your board, bring it to the table. Most board members will be receptive and look at that and start that dialogue. Influence the board. Once you influence the board and they sign up for it themselves, or you are already signed up to the living wage and you're paying the living wage, then the second part of your journey is to go and influence your supply chain. So engage with that supply chain. Don't just do it through a procurement process, a tendering process. Actually go and pick your strategic suppliers, survey them, and then ask them, are they paying the living wage? And if not, how many are? And then that will give you information that you can start to talk about. It will create an awareness of your current situation. And it also helps the suppliers to understand that more procurement organisations are talking about the living wage, because this is going to get stronger and stronger. So I want to encourage as many procurement organisations to start engaging with their suppliers and putting the living wage on the table, start debating it. They're the two recommendations I would put forward.
Thank you, David. Matthew, anything from your side?
So you cut out when the question was asked, but I'm assuming the question is recommendations for those today, right?
Yes.
So I think for me, I mean, we've invested in this data to become public, and I would say do your gap analysis and figure out where you stand on the issue. And I think to David's point, I mean, I think that's the type of data that you can also present to your board. I think living wage is one of those social areas that is one of the most measurable in terms of progress as well, but also in terms of the impact. So there's a good story to tell on living wage, and there's clear kind of business commercial benefits as well. So just get started and do your gap analysis, I think. And the second is not to focus on perfection. It's got to be, the focus has to be on progress. We don't have all the answers. Despite having been working on this since 2014, yes, we pay our own employees a living wage now, but we never started knowing how we would get there. We just started and we focused on that progress. And I think if we get paralyzed on the barriers or on trying to do it in a perfect way, we'll never get there. And I don't think that's the intention. I think the intention is really to focus on that progress.
Brilliant. Thank you. Ashley, what would be your recommendation for large companies?
To be honest, I don't think I can add anything of more value from what David and Matteo have just said. But what I would say is don't be scared of it. Don't be scared of having the conversations both internally and externally. Once you start having the conversation and speaking about it, you realise that there's definitely a gap in knowledge, and that's what you're doing is you're just educating about it. Have the chat, be passionate about it, and it will, I'm sure things will come to you naturally, because a lot of people just didn't really know the real living wage accreditation was a thing. And I'm finding that with a lot of my suppliers, and they're actually quite excited and interested about it, and about sharing the message. So go out and have the conversation.
Thank you. Thanks so much. And I think our participants have taken so much today from your insights, best practices, and they have a lot of takeaways from today's session. And just a last thing, and the question, David?
Can I just mention one?
Sure, please.
So you showed that video before, which I think is immensely impactful, and it hits at the heartstrings. So another recommendation is everyone can borrow that video. It was produced by Aviva, but go and show that video to your board, to people, because that's how impactful the living wage can be. Lynn has become famous in Siemens, so let's make her famous in lots of other organizations, because that will help put people on the journey. Sorry.
No, absolutely. Thank you, David, because one of the pledges from today is to engage with your internal teams and management to, get that buy-in from your top management. And I think that Lena's video can help our participants to put across this message. And of course, as I think one of our panelists and three of you have mentioned, to gain an understanding, bring that awareness around living wage and the impact that we can create through procurement, develop a better knowledge of our supply chain. And I think this is a kind of a missed opportunity. What we have seen, we don't know our supply chains. We don't know our supplier base. So even it starts with knowing our supply base better. And of course, communicate. Procurement has that influence on supplier base and supply partners. So start communicating with your supply chain. And with that, I think we have a lot of questions from our participants, and I will consolidate and reach out to you guys for certain responses over there. But for now, thank you so much for attending today's session. If you need to talk to us, please connect with us and we are happy to help you. Thank you so much for your time today.